Alright, today we're going to look at constructing an Archfiend deck. Deck construction in the Archfiend archetype has kind of evolved in an interesting way in that the original Archfiend concept is almost completely ignored now, which is kind of unfortunate because the idea was unique for the time, where you'd have powerful level 4 monsters that could be summoned, but at significant life point cost if not for a specific field card. In addition, the gamble protection theme was also kind of an interesting concept. Unfortunately for this concept, as the game aged, the life point cost became rather excessive relative to the power and effects associated with the kind of Generation 1 Archfiend monsters, and kind of making the deck rather pedestrian, not worth the effort. The second generation of Archfiends have proven more reliable, largely because they have abandoned the life point mechanic and instead transformed into kind of a generic archetype deck with standard searching and other forms of plussing. As I mentioned, it's rather sad that the original mechanic was replaced by a more standard run-of-the-mill mechanic already possessed by various other decks, but the effects associated with the original cards are just too lackluster to provide a viable deck in the current environment and more than likely any future environment going forward. Thus, constructing an Archfiend deck, you pretty much have to focus on the most recent generation of cards to be competitive. When building an Archfiend deck, the first objective is of course to look at the Archfiend cards and their associated support. When looking at the second generation, there is a clear distinction between those cards that should be run and those cards that are more questionable. First off, Archfiends do have an exceptional searcher in Archfiend Heiress, which can grab any Archfiend from the deck when sent to the graveyard via battle or card effect, whether it's from the field, hand, or even the deck. This effect even triggers if the card is sent to the graveyard as an XZ material when sent as part of the XZ monster's effect, not as a cost. Therefore, 3 copies are a must. Archfiend Cavalry is also a useful piece in an Archfiend deck, for it's a 1900 level 4 that grants a special summon of an Archfiend from the graveyard when destroyed by card effect. The nice part about this effect is the destruction can come from either your card effect or your opponent's card effect, not just your opponent's card effect. The drawback to this effect is the special summon monster cannot attack on the turn it's summoned, so do remember that negative, because that's one of those things you can kind of forget about. You can, I'm going to summon Cavalry, Dark Hole, get my special summons, and oh, wait, I can't attack. Overall, Cavalry is a nice 1900 attack point monster with that useful secondary effect, so I run 3 copies. Archfiend Emperor is an excellent boss-type monster for the archetype, with the ability to normal summon itself without tribute at 1500 attack, with its effects still live. Thereby it basically eliminates itself as a negative bad draw, because even at 1500 it can still do something, and it has its live ability to destroy 1 card on the field by simply banishing an Archfiend from your graveyard or hand. Due to the destruction effect, as well as the hey, I'm not a bad draw effect, 3 copies of Emperor is a must for any successful Archfiend deck. Not surprisingly, you want to take advantage of the Emperor's effect as much as possible. Thus, you'll find that there'll be a number of Archfiends removed from play, so I like to run 2 copies of Trance Archfiend to return those removed monsters to my hand. The usefulness of this part of Trance's effect is also be expanded on a little further when we flesh out the deck a little more. The discard effect works nicely in combination with Heiress, creating a temporary 2000 attack point monster, and then you also get your free search. The reason I don't run 3 is I have a tendency to draw at least 1, if not more than 1, in my opening hand, and when you do that, obviously his ability is somewhat muted in its usefulness. Change gears a bit and look at some of the more prominent Archfiend monsters that I don't run and why. Archfiend Empress is an interesting card, but for my taste its first effect is too limited and restrictive. Most of the monster removal currently run targets at once, your Regekis, your Dark Holes, your Torrential Tributes, your Mirror Forces, or does not destroy when removing from the field. Your various monster effects, your number 101s, your Castels, your Compulses, your Dimension Prisons. Thus, its effect has limited usefulness. And the secondary revival effect is rather useful, but somewhat restrictive unless in the late game or running a deck that's using Armageddon Knight. The immediate problem I see with Imprisoned Queen Archfiend is that it requires Pandemonium. Pandemonium is not a strong card for this deck because there are no life point payments for second generation Archfiends outside of Imprisoned Queen, and the inability to search for an equal level versus just a lower level Archfiend hurts its usefulness. If Pandemonium said equal or lower level Archfiend, it'd be a much better card, but it doesn't. This is not to say that if you want to put like an Armageddon Knight kind of spin on an Archfiend deck, Queen could not be useful, but the problems kind of also spill over into that effect. You have a lack of deck space. The 1,000 attack increase only lasts until your end phase, not your opponent's next end phase, and you have to have a monster during your standby phase to use its effect. Overall, they're just better options, as Imprisoned Queen Archfiend's effect just seems too restrictive. Inherently, there's something appealing about running Lesser Fiend in the current kind of graveyard as a second-hand-esque meta we seem to be in, but the problem is it's a 2100 attack point tribute monster with no protection or recursion effect, which heavily limits its overall usefulness, where there are better targets for the secondary effect of a card like Cavalry. Archfiend Commander has some nice combination potential with both Heiress and Cavalry, where with Heiress you exchange a 1000 attack point monster for a 2500 attack and get a free search, and with Cavalry you exchange a 1900 attack point monster for a 2500 attack and get a free special summons from the graveyard. The problem with this card is that when this effect is used, you cannot attack with Commander on the given turn, thus heavily mitigating the usefulness of the effect. Because if I put a 2500 attack point monster on the field, I want to attack with it. I don't want it just sit there, and there's numerous other ways for me to get Cavalry or Heiress's effect than just have a I'm dead for one turn 2500 attack point monster. The tribute summon effect is also somewhat disappointing. If the effect was a level 6 or lower, or even something like level 6 or a monster with the same level as the tributed monster, it would have been much better, but being only limited to a level 6, it's tough because that means you got to run a bunch of tribute monsters to get maximum utility out of it. But if you run a bunch of tribute monsters, you're going to have a lot more bad draws. Maybe if it had been level 6 or higher, it would have been better. Just something other than just level 6. So Commander's out. For me, Archfiend Giant I think is a nice card. It's the final Archfiend for this deck. It's a 2400 attack points, is nothing to sneeze at for a single tribute monster. At least allows it to suicide with some of the more popular choices. Its single shot protection effect is also a very useful trade-off, because it's pretty much an almost nothing life point payment of 500. And finally, its quasi-floating ability helps maintain some level of field control. I think 2 copies of Giant work nicely for me. Finally, adding in some of the general support, I think 2 copies of Battle Fader work well. It's a nice card for the deck because not only does it stop OTKs, but it works as tribute fodder for Giant and, to a lesser extent, Emperor. In addition, Fader in this deck is actually reusable because of Trance's effect to add it back into your hand after it's been destroyed and banished. While it's not an Archfiend, that doesn't stop me from running 3 copies of Mathematician in this deck, for it can produce pluses multiple ways, especially sending Heiress to the graveyard through its initial effect. And Heiress, in all actuality, is not a good draw, so any way you can get its effect without actually having to draw it into your hand is a good thing. Keeping with that theme, I run 1 tour guide, grab Heiress from the deck. The effect negation is pretty much irrelevant. In large respects, Heiress kind of plays the same role in this deck as Skarm does in Burning Abyss. Finishing up the monsters, I run 1 copy of Dark Armed Dragon, because due to Emperor's effect, it's easier to manipulate the number of dark monsters in your graveyard, which increases Dark Armed Dragon's utility. Moving on to the spells, first, the generic staples, 1 Regeki, 1 Book of Moon, 1 Soul Charge, 2 Dark Holes. Dark Hole is useful in this deck for both Heiress and Cavalry, as well as being generic targetless destruction. Also, we have a lot of dark monsters, so the quasi-dark monster kind of deck staple of 1 Allure of Darkness. The banishing is also somewhat mitigated because of Trance's secondary. Grab a banished card and add it to your hand effect. One of the biggest advantages of an Archfiend deck, and almost everyone who remembers Archfiend decks knows where I'm going here, it has its own type-specific Snatch Steal, Falling Down. Now, is Falling Down as good as Snatch Steal? Of course not. Very little is as good as Snatch Steal. However, Falling Down is still very good, and any legitimate Archfiend deck must run 3 copies. So, of course, 3 copies. The next card is probably, for me personally, the most controversial card I play. I hate this card. I loathe the fact that it even exists. This card represents sloppy and lazy card design, in my opinion, and it's kind of a mindset that somewhat permeates its way into Yu-Gi-Oh! Now and again. However, regrettably, I also think that not running this card does place this deck at a disadvantage. I've seen it when I've played it. The card in question is Mask Change 2. I hate this card because Masked Heroes should have been limited to hero decks. You want to run Dark Law? Then run a hero deck. But Mask Change 2 basically says if you run Dark Monster based deck, feel free to run this card, and by association, Dark Law. I think generic splashes significantly hurt the innovation and creativity of the game. They make too many decks look too much alike. For example, adding Mask Change 2 into a Skull Servant deck is not innovative, but in today's environment it's almost expected, and that's in some sense unfortunate. However, the game is also about winning, and if this deck is going to maximize its winning potential, Mask Change 2 is a definitely useful choice. Closing out the spells, I run 1 copy of MST for obvious reasons, to take out that back row and take a little pressure off using Emperor's Effect to that extent. Moving on to the traps, I have 3 of the 4 what I view as the single limited staples. I run 1 Torrential, 1 Bottomless, and 1 Solemn Warning. With 3 copies of Emperor, I like to run 2 copies of Call of the Haunted to increase the probability of getting Emperor on the field as a 3,000 attack point monster with a live destruction effect. Finally, a great trap I think for this deck that I rarely see used anymore, period, is Sinister Yoroshiru. I imagine a number of people are going to be unfamiliar with this card's effects, so let's read it. Each turn, 1 level 5 or higher Fiend-Type monster you normal summon can be summoned without tributing. If exactly 1 normal, summoned, or set level 5 or higher Fiend-Type monster and no other card would be destroyed, you can send this card to the graveyard instead. What a great card for Fiend decks. As I mentioned, is almost never used. I don't know, possibly because maybe it's really only useful in Archfiend decks and Dark World decks, and Dark World players typically focus exclusively on Grapha, because both Steel Swarm and Infernoids can't really use this card to its fullest, and you don't see a lot of kind of generic, I'm just running a Fiend deck without a kind of archetype theme to it. But Sinister gives you destruction protection as well as the ability to summon a level 5 or higher monster without tribute once per turn, as long as it's on the field. So Sinister really maximizes the potential of Heiress. There are times when you might be a little squeamish about getting a Giant or an Emperor because, well, I don't have what I need to put it on the field. I only have the Emperor for 1 turn before it destroys itself. I can't use the Giant. If you've got Sinister on the field, go ahead and use that Heiress to get Emperor. Get a 3,000 attack point monster that can nuke stuff. Go ahead and get Giant. Get a 2,400 attack point quasi-floater. The continuous nature of this card is really what makes it great. If this was a normal trap, then it probably wouldn't be worth running. But it's not. It's continuous. I think 3 copies are definitely what you should be using in your Archfiend deck. Moving on to the extra deck, I run 1 Dark Hero Anki because sometimes Dark Law's 2400 attack is just not enough, and you need that extra 400. Obviously, I run 2 copies of Dark Law. I run 2 rank 8s, because it's possible to make rank 8s from your Emperors due to your Call of the Haunted, your Sinisters. So I run Sun Dragon Overlord. It's targetless removal, plus it creates a plus if you're discarding Heiress, and 1 Dragon Knight Felgrand. I run 1 rank 6 Photon Strike Bouncer. It can be created through my 2 Giants. Monster negation is always welcome. I run 2 rank 3s, 1 Acid Golem. I think Acid Golem's a lot better than a number of other people because you rarely get to that point where Acid Golem becomes a negative. It's usually just a 3,000 point beater that your opponent eventually gets rid of. And 1 wind-up Zenmanes. I mean, both of these cards are also nice because you can get Heiress's effect when detaching from both. Not surprisingly, I run the standard rank 4 staples, Exciton Knight, number 101, Castel, XYZ Dragon. I also run Anti-Luminescent Knight, Gagaga Cowboy, and finally I like to run number 66 Master Keyed Beetle. I think it's another card that has high attack power for a rank 4, as well as it has its protection effect that can extend the length of time a Sinister is on the field. Overall, I think some people might ask, where's the Supply Squad? Supply Squad's definitely a nice card, but the problem I have with it in this deck is I like the construction of this deck. I have no idea what I'd take out in favor of the Supply Squad. And Supply Squad's also kind of a bad top deck. If you don't get Supply Squad early, Supply Squad's not a very good card in my opinion. And also my experience, so I don't know. You want to add a Supply Squad, take something out, throw it in there, but for me it just doesn't seem to work well in this particular deck. Some people might be asking, where's Archfiend Roar? Well, I think Archfiend Roar is significantly inferior to the Call of the Haunted. I can see some of the combo potentials with it, and the most attractive feature with Roar is probably that it can be searched out by Heiress. But I just like the greater consistency and field presence of Call of the Haunted over Archfiend's Roar. I don't like running Monarch Stormforth in this deck because you only have 2 Giants. I think Sinister basically replaces Stormforth and does all of the heavy lifting in a much better capacity than what Stormforth can do. Finally, as I alluded to earlier, I'm not a fan of Pandemonium in this deck because half of its effect is worthless, and the second half is hindered by the ability to only search for lower level monsters rather than equal or lower level monsters. Also, I think Archfiend Palabyrinth has the same issue. If the card destroyed instead of banished, then yeah, the card probably would be a staple in Archfiend decks. However, it doesn't, which heavily limits the overall influence this card can have because it eliminates a lot of the combo potential with other Archfiend cards. You don't get Heiress's effect, you don't get Cavalry's effect, you don't get Giant's effect. And if you play Archfiends, you're going to realize that swarming the field tends not to be one of their strengths. Overall, I think the biggest problem you'll see with Archfiends is that at times they can be slow, but they are also very good at grinding. They're also fun and can compete against other competitive decks, and they don't embarrass themselves against the so-called big boy tier 1 decks. So if you're looking to shake up your local or maybe even a regional, this deck is definitely a viable option. Well, that concludes this build. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.